The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was the ceiling of a hospital room. The second thing I saw was my mother looking at me, not with relief, not with tears, but with a frown. "Oh, you're awake," she said flatly. Before I could even ask what had happened, my father stepped closer. "Did the insurance company call yet?" I blinked through the haze. "What?" "The car," he said impatiently. "Is it totaled?" My chest hurt every time I breathed. My left arm was wrapped in bandages, and machines beside my bed beeped steadily. I had just survived a serious car crash, and the first questions my parents asked weren't whether I was in pain or if I was going to recover. They wanted to know about the car. A nurse paused outside my room, clearly expecting some emotional reunion. Instead, she watched my parents exchange a quick look before my mother sighed. "We can't stay," she said. "Something more urgent came up." Then they turned around and walked out. 3 days later, while I was still trying to sit up without feeling dizzy, my phone finally buzzed. I thought maybe they were checking on me. Instead, I read 6 words that changed everything. "We need $2,700 for your brother's lawyer." I stared at the screen, reading the message again just to make sure I hadn't misunderstood it. Not one sentence asking how I was healing. Not one apology for disappearing. Not one, "Are you okay?" Just a demand. The crash itself had happened on a rainy evening after work. Another driver lost control at an intersection and slammed into the driver's side of my car. I remembered the sound of twisting metal, the airbags exploding, and then almost nothing until waking up in that hospital bed. The doctors told me I'd been lucky. I had broken bones, deep bruising, and a concussion, but I was expected to recover with time. Apparently, my parents had reached a different conclusion. To them, my accident was an inconvenience that interrupted whatever crisis my younger brother had created this time. That wasn't exactly new. Growing up, everything somehow revolved around him. If he needed help, plans changed. If he made a mistake, everyone else was expected to fix it. I spent years convincing myself that if I kept helping, kept being responsible, kept saying yes whenever my family needed something, eventually my parents would notice. Lying in that hospital bed, I realized they already had noticed. They simply expected it. I looked back at my mother's message. "We need $2,700 for your brother's lawyer." No greeting. No concern. Just another bill addressed to me. Something inside me finally stopped trying to earn their approval. I opened my banking app. I typed in the amount. Not $2,700. $1. In the memo line, I wrote exactly 2 words. "Good luck." I hit send. Then I opened my phone settings, changed my number, and set the device on the bedside table. For the first time in years, I felt strangely calm. The next morning, there was a firm knock on my hospital door. I looked up as 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside. One of them asked, "Are you Cindy?" My stomach dropped. Why were the police here? The 2 officers waited just inside the doorway, while the nurse finished checking my blood pressure. "I'll give you a few minutes," she said, glancing from me to the officers before quietly leaving the room. The silence felt heavier than the cast on my arm. My mind raced through impossible possibilities. Had the other driver been seriously hurt? Was there something wrong with my insurance? Had something happened to my brother? One of the officers offered a polite smile. "There's no emergency. We just need to ask you a few questions." Even hearing those words didn't calm me down. As I waited for them to begin, memories I hadn't wanted to revisit came rushing back. My brother had always been the center of my parents' world. When he lost his job, I paid 2 months of his rent because my mother insisted he just needed a little help. When his car broke down, I loaned him money that somehow became a gift no one expected him to repay. When unexpected bills showed up, my parents called me first, not because I had caused the problem, but because I was the responsible one. "You've always been so dependable," my mother liked to say. It sounded like a compliment. It was really an expectation. Every time I said yes, the requests grew larger. Every time my brother made another reckless decision, my parents found a way to make it my responsibility. After the crash, I honestly believed things might be different. I thought seeing me in a hospital bed would remind them that I wasn't just the family's backup plan. I was their daughter. Instead, they asked about my insurance, left within minutes, and disappeared until they needed money for my brother's lawyer. The nurse returned briefly with fresh water. She hesitated before speaking. "You know," she said gently, "everyone deserves visitors who come because they're worried about them." She wasn't criticizing my parents. She was simply stating what she'd witnessed. After she left, I picked up my phone and looked at the empty contact list where my parents' numbers used to be. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I made myself one silent promise. No more loans. No more rescuing. Not another dollar. One of the officers opened a small notebook and finally broke the silence. "Ms. Cindy," he said, meeting my eyes, "we'd like to ask you about a complaint your parents filed." "I don't understand," I said, staring at the officer. "A complaint? About what?" The older of the two officers took a seat beside my hospital bed while his partner remained standing. "Your parents told us you agreed to pay for your brother's attorney," he explained. "According to their report, you suddenly became unreachable, and they believe you're withholding money that belonged to the family." For a moment, I was too stunned to answer. "They called the police because I didn't give them money." "We're here to gather facts," the officer replied evenly. "That's why we'd like to hear your side." I reached for my phone. I can show you exactly what happened. First, I pulled up my hospital admission records. The date and time matched the night of the crash. Then I showed them the message from my mother, the first contact I'd received after they walked out of my room. The officer read it silently. "We need $2,700 for your brother's lawyer." He looked up. "Was there any conversation before this?" "No," I answered. "That's the entire exchange." Next came my bank records. There was no family account, no shared funds, no missing money, only years of ordinary transactions from my own personal account. Finally, I showed them the $1 transfer. The younger officer raised an eyebrow. "You sent $1. "Yes." "And the note." "Good luck." Neither officer laughed. Instead, they carefully photographed the screenshots and copied the relevant dates into their report. By the time they left my room, their questions had changed. They were no longer asking where the money had gone. They were asking when my parents first demanded it. Word traveled through my family much faster than I expected. That afternoon, my phone, now using my new number that only a few trusted people had, began receiving calls from relatives who had gotten it through my aunt. "Cindy," one cousin said, "your mom told everyone you promised to help and then disappeared." "I didn't disappear," I replied. "I was in a hospital bed." Instead of arguing, I simply forwarded screenshots of the messages and the hospital timeline. One by one, the conversations changed. Nobody could explain why my parents had skipped over my recovery and gone straight to asking for money. My aunt called last. "I've compared what your mother told me with those messages," she said quietly. "Something doesn't match." A few hours later, my phone rang again. It was the investigating officer. His voice was calm, but his next sentence immediately raised the stakes. "We found something in your parents' statement that doesn't add up." By the next morning, the investigation had shifted in a direction I never expected. The officer asked if I could come to the station once I was discharged so they could clarify a few final details. My doctor approved the short trip, and a friend drove me there. Inside a small interview room, the same two officers spread several documents across the table. "We've been comparing everyone's timelines," the older officer said. "We need you to walk us through yours one more time." I described the crash, my arrival at the hospital, and the days that followed. Every event matched my medical records. Then the officer slid one page toward me. Your parents stated that you agreed to pay for your brother's attorney during a conversation shortly after the accident. I frowned. That's impossible. He nodded. According to your hospital records, you were unconscious during the time they listed. The room fell silent. The officers had already confirmed my admission time, my medical condition, and the periods when I wasn't capable of having any meaningful conversation. Phone activity showed no calls from me during that window either. Their timeline simply didn't fit the evidence. After returning home, I searched through years of old messages stored in cloud backups. There they were. Texts asking for emergency loans. Requests to cover bills. Promises that money would be repaid next month. It almost never was. I organized every conversation, every transfer, and every request into a single chronological file. Looking at it all together, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, relatives who had initially questioned me stopped calling to pressure me. Instead, several quietly admitted they had begun distancing themselves from my parents after seeing the documentation. My brother never contacted me. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply disappeared from every family conversation. For the first time, I realized the $2,700 demand had never been an isolated incident. It was just the latest chapter in years of expecting me to solve problems I hadn't created. Before ending the meeting, the officers asked one last factual question to complete their report. I answered it, gathered my paperwork, and headed toward the lobby. Just as I reached the exit, I heard footsteps behind me. Ms. Cindy, one of the officers called. I turned. He held a finalized report in his hand. You're going to want to hear this. I walked back into the interview room as the officer placed the completed report on the table. We've finished reviewing the evidence, he said. He looked directly at me before continuing. There isn't any evidence that you stole money, withheld family funds, or committed fraud. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The timeline in the complaint doesn't match your medical records, he explained. Your hospital documentation, phone records, bank records, and the text messages all support your account. Based on what we've verified, there's no basis for criminal action. Just like that, it was over. No charges. No investigation hanging over my head. No obligation to defend myself any further. As I walked out of the station, I expected to feel angry. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. The car crash hadn't changed my parents. It had simply stripped away every excuse I had made for them. For years, I told myself they were stressed. That my brother was going through a difficult time. That family helped family. But when I was lying in a hospital bed after a serious accident, they hadn't asked whether I would recover. They had asked about insurance. Then they had asked for money. When I refused, they tried to pressure me by involving the police. There wasn't anything left to misunderstand. Over the following week, relatives who had called to question me began calling back for a different reason. I'm sorry, one cousin admitted. We only heard your parents' version. My aunt apologized too. I should have asked you first, she said. The screenshots made everything clear. I didn't argue with anyone. I simply forwarded the same messages, the same timestamps, and the same records I'd already shared with the officers. Facts spoke louder than explanations ever could. As more family members saw the complete timeline, the financial support my parents had quietly depended on began disappearing. People stopped volunteering money without asking questions first. My brother still had to deal with his legal problems, but this time he had to do it without my savings. For the first time in his life, I wasn't there to cushion the consequences of his choices. I never reopened contact with my parents. Instead, I changed every practical part of my life that had once given them access to me. I kept my new phone number private. I opened separate bank accounts they knew nothing about. I updated my emergency contacts, So the people listed were friends who had actually shown up for me during my recovery. I reviewed my legal documents and removed every assumption that my family would automatically be involved if something happened to me again. Those changes weren't dramatic. They were quiet, permanent. Months later, my injuries had healed. I moved into a new apartment that felt like a fresh start, and I spent my time with people who checked on me because they cared, not because they wanted something. Sometimes, I still thought about the $1 transfer. People assumed it was meant to insult my parents. It wasn't. It was simply the last transaction I would ever make with people who only remembered I existed when they needed my wallet. The accident left scars that eventually faded. What stayed with me was the lesson the police visit forced me to accept. Some relationships don't end with one argument. They end the moment you stop financing someone else's sense of entitlement. The crash changed my life, but walking away from my parents was what finally saved it.